Chapter 2 of Four Girls at Chautauqua. Four Girls at Chautauqua by Pansy. Chapter 2 The Question Discussed. Rev. Dr. Dennis and Rev. Mr. Harrison met just at the corner of Howard and Clinton Streets, and stopped for a chat. Dr. Dennis was the pastor of the First Church, and Mr. Harrison was pastor of the Fourth, and some of the sheep belonging to these respective flocks supposed the two churches to be rivals, but the pastors thereof never thought such a thing. On the contrary, they were always getting up excuses for coming in contact with each other, and woe to the work that was waiting for each when they chanced to meet of a morning on some shady corner. "You are to be represented, I hear, at the coming assembly," said Mr. Harrison, as they shook hands in that hearty way which says, as plainly as words, "How very glad I am to see you." Dr. Dennis shrugged his shoulders. "Such a representation," he said. "If the entire congregation had been canvassed, it would have been impossible to have made more curious selections. I do wish we could have some real workers from the different churches." "Miss Erskine isn't a member of the church, is she?" "None of them are members, nor Christians; nor have they an atom of interest in any such matters. They are going for pure fun, and nothing else." "Now, perhaps they will happily disappoint you by coming back with a wholesome interest aroused in Sunday school work, and will really go into the work for themselves." "I don't want them," Dr. Dennis said, stoutly. "I wouldn't give a dime for 100 such workers. They are an injury to the cause. I want Sunday school workers who have a personal, vital sense of the worth of souls, and a consuming desire to see them converted. All other Sunday school teaching is aimless." Mr. Harrison looked thoughtful. "We haven't many such, I am afraid," he said, gravely, "but I agree with you in thinking that they should at least be Christians. Still, I suppose that it is not impossible that some one of these ladies may be converted." "Not at Chautauqua," Dr. Dennis said, as one who had looked into the matter and knew all about it. "I am not entirely in sympathy with that meeting, anyway; or, that is, I am and I am not all at once. I think it would be a great place for you and me. I haven't the least doubt but that we could be refreshed, bodily and mentally, and, for that matter, spiritually. If the whole world were converted, I should vote for Chautauqua with a loud voice. But I am more than fearful as to the influence of such meetings on the masses, the unconverted world. They will go there for recreation. Their whole aim will be to have a glorious frolic away from the restraints of ordinary home life. They will have no interest in the meetings, no sympathy with the central thought that has drawn the workers together, and the tendency will be to frolic through it all. The truth is, there will be such a mixing of things that I actually fear the effect will be wholesale demoralization. At the same time I am interested in the idea, and am watching it with anxiety. Since I have heard of the delegation from my own church, I have been more convinced still of the evil influences. It makes me gloomy to think of the fruitful field such a place will be for the fertile brain of that little Eurie Mitchell. She is too wild now for civilized life. The four walls of the church and the sacred associations connected with the building serve to keep her only half controlled when she is actually attending Sabbath service. There will be nothing to control her in the woods, and she will lose what little reverence she possesses. I tell you, the more I think of it, the more certain I am that for such people these great religious jubilees, holding over the Sabbath, do harm." "You put it more gently than our friend Mr. Archer," Mr. Harrison said, smiling. "He is in a condition of absolute scorn. He gives none of them credit for honesty or genuine interest. He says it is a running away from work, a regular shirking of what they ought to be doing, and going off into the woods to have a good time, and, by way of gulling the public, they pretend to season it with religion." Dr. Dennis laughed. "That sounds precisely like him, and is quite as logical as one could expect, coming from that source," he said indifferently. "Why doesn't it occur to his dull brain, that thinks itself such a sharp one, that the leaders thereof are men responsible to no one save God and their own consciences for the way in which they spend their time? There is nothing earthly to hinder their going into the woods and staying 3 months if they please to do so." "Oh, but I have left out one of the important reasons for the meeting. It is to make money; a grand speculation, whereby the fortunes of those same leaders are to be made at the expense of the poor victims whom they gather about them." Again Dr. Dennis's shoulders went upward in that peculiar but expressive shrug. "Of all the precarious and dangerous ways of making a fortune, I should think that went ahead," he said, still laughing. "What an idea, now! Shouldn't you suppose people with common sense would have some faint idea of the immense expenses to be involved in such an undertaking, and the tremendous risks to be run? If they succeed in meeting their expenses this year, I think they will have cause for rejoicing." "The point that puzzles me," Mr. Harrison said, "is what particular commandment they would be breaking if they should actually happen to have 25 cents to put in their pockets when the meeting closed; though, as you say, I doubt the probability. But they force no one to come; it is a matter for individual decision, and they render a fair equivalent for every cent of money spent; at least, if the spender thinks it is not a fair equivalent he is foolish to go; so why should they not make enough to justify them in giving their time to this work?" "Of course, of course," assented Dr. Dennis, heartily. "They ought to; none but an idiot would think otherwise." It is to be presumed that both these gentlemen had gotten so far away from the name that was quoted as holding these views as to forget all about him, else they certainly would not have been guilty of calling a brother minister an idiot, however much his arguments might suggest the thought. "But," continued Dr. Dennis, "my trouble lies, as I said, in the results. I have no sort of doubt that great good will be done, and I have the same feeling of certainty that harm will be done. Take it in my own church. We are so situated, or we think ourselves so situated, that not a single one of the earnest, hearty workers who would come back to us with a blessing for themselves and us, is able to go. Instead, we have 4 representatives who will turn the whole thing into ridicule, and dish it up for the entertainment of their friends during the coming winter. That Miss Erskine seems to have a special talent for getting up Thursday evening entertainments, to invite our people who are supposed to be interested in the prayer meeting, but who rarely fail to make it convenient to go to the party. I imagine a bevy of them being entertained by Eurie Mitchell. She can do it, and she is looking forward to just that sort of thing, for I heard her rejoicing over it. That girl will be injured by Chautauqua; I know it as well as though I already saw it; and the question with me is, whether the amount of evil done will not overbalance the good. At the same time I am inconsistent enough to wish with all my heart that I could be there." "What about Miss Shipley? Perhaps relief will come to you from that quarter." Those shoulders again. "She is nothing in the world but a little pink feather, and she blows precisely in the direction of the strongest current; and Satan looks out for her with untiring patience that the wind shall blow in the exact direction where it can do her the most harm. Going to Chautauqua with the influences that will surround her, with Miss Erskine and Miss Wilbur on the one side, and Eurie Mitchell on the other, will be the very best thing that Satan can do next for her, and he doubtless knows it." "I do not know Miss Wilbur at all. Is she also one of your flock?" Dr. Dennis's face was dark and sad. "She is an infidel," he said, decidedly. "She does not call herself such; she wouldn't like to be known as such, because it would be likely to affect her position in the school. But the name is rightly hers, and she would do less harm in the world if she owned it." "It is an extraordinary representation, I declare," Mr. Harrison said, a little startled. "I have been half inclined to be envious of you, because you were to hear so directly from the meeting, but I believe on the whole I shall be quite as well off without any delegates as you will with them." "Better, decidedly. I am distressed at the whole thing. It will result disastrously for them all, you mark my words." And having settled the affairs at Chautauqua, apparently beyond all repeal, the brethren shook hands again and went to their studies. Meantime the express train was giving occasional premonitory snorts, and the 4 young ladies who had been so thoroughly discussed were in various stages of unrest, waiting for the moment of departure. A looker on would have been able to come to marked conclusions concerning the different characters of these young ladies, simply from their manner of dress. Flossy Shipley was the one to look at first. That was a very good description of her usual style, something to look at. She had chosen for her traveling dress a pale lavender cashmere, of that delightful shade that resents a drop of water as promptly as a drop of oil. It was trimmed with a contrasting shade of silk, and trimmed profusely. Yards of gathered trimming, headed by yards of flat pleating, and that in turn headed by yards of folds. The dainty sacque and hat, and the 4-buttoned gloves, were as faultless as to fit and as delicate in color as the dress. In short, Miss Flossy looked as though she might be ready for an evening concert. Moreover, she felt as if she were, or at least she had an uncomfortable consciousness as to clothes. She kept a nervous lookout for the lower flounce whenever the crowd of people surged her way, and brushed vigorously at the arm of the seat she had chosen ere she dared to rest her arm on it. Evidently she had given herself over to the martyrdom of thinking of and caring for clothes during this journey, and I don't know whether there is a greater martyrdom made out of a trifle than that. It was one of Flossy's besetting sins, this arraying herself in glory, and making wrinkles in her face in the vain attempt to keep so. Not that she was particularly anxious to save the wear and tear, only she hated to look spotted and wrinkled, and she could never seem to learn the simple lesson of wearing the things best suited to the occasion. Standing near her, toying carelessly with her traveling fan, and looking as though the thought of dress was something that had passed utterly by her, was Miss Erskine. She looked like one of those ladies whom gentlemen in their wisdom are always selecting, pointing them out as models. So tasteful and appropriate, and withal so simple in their dress. Let me tell you about her dress. It was a plain dark brown, precisely the shade of brown that the fashion of the season required. It was of a soft, lusterless silk. It was very simply made, almost severely plain, as Miss Erskine knew became a traveler. In fact, elegant simplicity marked her entire toilet, everything matched, everything was fresh and spotless, and arranged with an eye to remaining so. I am willing to concede that she was faultlessly dressed, and it was a real pleasure to see her thus. But I am also anxious to have the gentlemen understand that that same simple attire represented more money than 2 wardrobes like Flossy Shipley's. It is often so with those delightfully plain and simple dresses that attract so many people. In fact, it might as well be admitted, since we are on that subject, that elegant simplicity is sometimes a very expensive article. Eurie Mitchell was neither particularly elegant nor noted for simplicity, yet her dress was not without character. We see enough of that sort to become familiar with what it means. Its language is simply a straightened purse, necessitating the putting together of shades that do not quite harmonize, and trimming in a way that will cover the most spots and take the least material. That was Eurie's dress. Skirt of one kind and overdress of another. A very economical fashion, and one not destined to last long because of its economy, and the fact that very elegant ladies rather curl their lips at it, and call it the patchwork style. Eurie from necessity rather than choice adopted it, and it was also her misfortune rather than her taste that the colors were too light to be really according to the mode. Her gloves were of an entirely different shade from the rest of the attire, and were mended with a shade of silk that did not quite match. Altogether, Eurie's dress did not suit Miss Erskine; but, for that matter, neither did it suit herself, with this difference, that it was, after all, a matter of minor importance to her. Miss Wilbur's dress can be disposed of in a single sentence. It was a black alpaca skirt, not too long, and severely plain, covered to within 3 inches with a plain brown linen polonaise. Her black hat with a band of velvet about it, fastened by a single heavy knot, and her somewhat worn black gloves completed her toilet, and she looked every inch a lady. The very people who would have curled their aristocratic lips at Eurie's attempt at style, turned and gave Miss Wilbur a second thoughtful, respectful look. There was a Mr. Wayne who deserves attention. He possessed himself of Miss Erskine's fan, and played with it carelessly while he said: "You are a queer set. What are you all going off there for, to bury yourselves in the woods? I don't believe one of you has an idea what you are about, and it is the very height of the season, too." "That is the trouble," Miss Erskine said, with a little toss of her handsome head. "We are sick of the season, and want to get away from it. I want something new. That is precisely what I am going for." "I have no doubt you will find it," and the gentleman gave a disdainful shrug to his shoulders. "Out in the backwoods attending a hallelujah meeting! I am sure I envy you." "You don't know what we will find," Eurie Mitchell said, with a defiant air. "Nor what may happen to us before we return. We may meet our destinies. I have no doubt they are lurking for us behind some of the trees. Just you meet the evening train of Wednesday, 2 weeks hence, and see if you can not discover the finger of fate having been busy with us. Wonderful things can happen in 2 weeks." Just then the train gave its last warning howl, and Mr. Wayne made rapid good byes, a trifle more lingering in the case of Miss Erskine than the others, and with that prophetic sentence still ringing in his ears he departed. And the 4 girls were actually en route for Chautauqua. CHAPTER III.